The breaking news this morning, Roger Stone, who advised President Trump's 2016 presidential campaign, has been arrested, and a grand jury has handed down a 7-count indictment from the special counsel's office, including 1 count of obstruction of justice, 1 count of witness tampering, and 5 counts of making false statements. Mr. Stone was arrested in Fort Lauderdale today, indicted by the federal grand jury in the District of Columbia. He'll make his initial court appearance later today at the federal courthouse in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. The indictment from the special counsel's office reads this way. During the summer of 2016, Stone spoke to senior Trump campaign officials about Organization One, a reference there to WikiLeaks, and information it might have had that would be damaging to the Clinton campaign. Stone was contacted by senior Trump campaign officials to inquire about future releases by Organization One. The indictment goes on. By, in, or around early August 2016, Stone was claiming both publicly and privately to have communicated with Organization One. By, in, or around mid-August 2016, Organization One made a public statement denying direct communication with Stone. Thereafter, Stone said his communication with Organization One had occurred through a person Stone described as a mutual friend, a go-between, and an intermediary. Stone also continued to communicate with members of the Trump campaign about Organization One and its intended future releases. The indictment claims Stone took steps to obstruct investigations by the House, Senate, and FBI into Russian interference, accusing Stone of making multiple false statements to Congress, denying he possessed records with evidence, and attempting to persuade a witness to provide false testimony. Joining us now in studio, former CIA Director John Brennan. He is a senior national security and intelligence analyst for NBC News. Mr. Director, good to see you. I know you haven't read through the indictment. We're still reading through it ourselves. But what's your initial reaction to the arrest of Roger Stone?
The term that's being used is unsurprising. Everybody was expecting this. Roger Stone was expecting it as well. But like many people in the Trump orbit, Mr. Stone has an established track record of being unethical and unprincipled. And now this is catching up with him. And now a 7-count indictment. I think it's a very serious one. But it shows that the special counsel's office is uncovering the evidence it needs. And so just like Mr. Stone's indictment, I'm not going to be surprised by the other indictments that are going to be coming down the pike very soon.
Roger Stone has said recently, I will never testify against Donald Trump. Do you think that calculus has changed this morning?
I think it's changing and will change. If he decides to go down for Mr. Trump, it's going to be, his loss. But I think there are many people who have that position and then change it very quickly when, as it was said, the federal guidelines, sentencing guidelines, tend to sink into them.
The excerpts of the account I just read describing the way that the special counsel's office alleges Roger Stone worked with WikiLeaks and passed that information on to the Trump campaign, and in fact that the Trump campaign sought out that information, that it was not a one-way communication. Does that ring true to what you know about the case?
Absolutely. In the summer of 2016, we were watching what was happening in terms of what was being released by WikiLeaks and how the Russian hand was behind this. And so the intermediaries was something that was looked at very closely by the FBI and others. So again, this indictment is not surprising in any respect.
Elise.
How many more indictments would you expect among the senior Trump campaign officials that are referenced in here? Stone told senior Trump campaign officials about materials possessed by Organization One, WikiLeaks. So that's in the multiple. And then also there is a Trump supporter that Stone was interfacing with about the WikiLeaks drop.
Well, I expect that probably within the next 60 days, you're going to have a fair number of indictments. A fair number, a significant number of indictments. I think people are waiting for the report that is coming out from Robert Mueller, but what I look for most is the indictments, and it's so rich in detail. To me, I think all of these indictments are going to be basically the compendium of the Robert Mueller investigation, special counsel's investigation. So I expect there to be a significant number, and a significant number of names that are going to be quite familiar to the average American.
Danny, and also Mr. Brennan, what is actually happening as we speak? Where is Roger Stone? What's happening? What is the process now? They showed up at his home. Take us through, and what's happening exactly?
When you're arrested in a federal crime, for a federal crime, out of the district where you're being prosecuted, the very first step is your initial appearance, and that is in the district where you're arrested.
That's this afternoon. What's happening right now?
That's the initial appeal. He's going to be brought before the magistrate in the federal district where he was arrested, and he'll get his initial appearance, which deals with things like bail, release, just very preliminary
issues. Is he in a
issues.
holding cell right now? Is he being interrogated? Right now, he's been arrested, okay? So now he's got 8 hours before he appears. What is his day today?
He may be being held, but it's unlikely he's being interrogated because at this point, number one, there's no need. They would certainly Mirandize him. They'd read him his rights. He would probably, almost certainly know not to give any statements at that time, and they're probably not even bothering. They already have the information they need for their indictment. He will lawyer up, and then down the road, if he wants to give them statements, he can do that. But for today, he is likely being processed. He's sitting in the courthouse. They usually have facilities underneath the building or in the building or nearby to hold him. Once they have his initial appearance, if he's held, then they will transport him back up to the district for a hearing very, very quickly. He'll only be in Florida for a very brief time.
And he makes an initial appearance at 11 a.m. at the federal courthouse in Fort Lauderdale today. One of the things we've seen, Director Brennan, the Trump White House and members of the Trump campaign do when someone is identified in the Mueller probe and eventually agrees and participates in the investigation, cooperates, is they sort of disconnect themselves from him and say, well, he didn't really have a role in the campaign. Michael Cohen, he was the pool boy or whatever they want to call him. It's going to be very difficult for them to do this if you read this indictment with Roger Stone, given the fact that this was a reciprocal relationship, given the fact that there were requests from the Trump campaign for information from Roger Stone, as documented in this indictment.
Well, it's very difficult for them to do, but unfortunately, they don't seem to be concerned about the reality of facts, and therefore they'll continue to push out whatever they want just to be able to make their point and try to, again, appeal to their base and make the claim that they never had any engagement in anything that was illegal. But I think it just is being proved false by all these indictments and all of the individuals who were associated with Trump for so long.
I want to ask you, too, as we continue to talk about this story, the other NBC report this morning about Jared Kushner, senior advisor of the president, the son-in-law, of course, of President Trump, being first denied top secret security clearance, but then this man, Carl Klein, who was running security at the White House, coming in and overruling that decision. Unusual, according to our reporting in White Houses, for that to happen. Elise has worked in the White House, says she can't remember it happening. What's your reaction to that story?
Well, in my 33 years of government service, I never heard of the White House making a security clearance decision,
right,
either to revoke or to grant. Sometimes the White House would weigh in with intelligence agencies, the FBI, and asking them to take another look at somebody that might have been denied, and then it would be adjudicated, and there'd be some back and forth, but the decision always rested with the intelligence agencies or the FBI in terms of whether or not somebody was eligible for it. I have never heard a decision being made by somebody in the White House to make the final decision about whether somebody should be granted access to top secret information.
And it wasn't just Jared Kushner. Our reporting says there were 30 other people who at first were denied top secret clearance, but then granted it by this. What's your spidey senses tell you?
Well, that's the politicization of the intelligence process, and that's something that undermines the integrity of the system. It certainly sends a very bad signal to the individuals, the investigators and others who do their best to make sure that people who have access to classified information are entitled to it based on their background. So again, it's a White House decision that should never have been made.
Mr. Brennan, as you kind of watch the Mueller dominoes fall, and you said more to come very, very soon. Who's the next domino? I'll put you on the spot. I'm going to Jimmy the Greek here. Who's the next domino?
I don't know.
That's all. Speculate. Give me a
No,
best.
I'm not going to speculate. No, because people are innocent until alleged to be involved in some type of criminal activity.
Director Brennan, I notice in leafing through this indictment, we've only just gotten it, that it appears Roger Stone is only indicted for things that happened after the investigation began. But you said an investigation was underway back in 2016. Can we read from this indictment that the special counsel's office believes that what Roger Stone did in 2016, before he committed these lying to investigators or whatever, that was all legal?
No. Again, I haven't read the indictment, and I know that in the summer of 2016, I had numerous conversations with Jim Comey about what was happening in terms of what the Russians were doing, what was being pushed out publicly, how they got access to the information, who might have facilitated the release of information. And so whether or not Roger Stone was involved in any of that, again, I defer to the special counsel's office. But it was an ongoing, very intense investigation at that time to see what U.S. person persons or officials might have been working with the Russians, either wittingly or unwittingly, to interfere in the election.
As you say, Director Brennan, we'll wait to see Mueller's report till we get the full picture of all this, but we do have a lot of pieces of it now that we've seen cooperation agreements and now indictments. What's the story, as you see it, that Mueller has begun to tell with the public information that we have?
That there was an extensive effort to try to influence the outcome of the election that involved the Russians, that involved U.S. persons, and that may have gone to the very top of the Trump campaign. And so I think the shoes that are yet to drop are going to be the ones that are going to be the most profound and that will hit the people at the top of the organization. Who that is?
Top of the organization, meaning Donald Trump?
It may be, may not.
Including family members?
Well, I think, clearly they have been talked to, they've been interviewed by the FBI. I think there's a fair amount of vulnerability that they might have on this. But again, I defer to the special counsel's office to make the determination about whether what they did crossed that threshold from collusion, which I think is quite evident, to criminal conspiracy. And it's whether or not it's past that threshold that is going to lead then to an indictment of individuals that are close to Mr. Trump, that are part of his family, or others.
Well, we got a 7-count indictment this morning of Roger Stone. He's been arrested, and he has a court appearance at a federal courthouse in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, coming up in just a few hours this morning. Former CIA Director John Brennan, thanks for your time this morning.
Thanks,
Good to see you. We'll be right back on Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.